This is a very special event with Dr. Gerald Horne. So I'd just like to start this off with acknowledging that we are, or some of us here are on Naarm, and some of the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. Land in Australia was stolen through colonisation. No treaties were ever signed, and this is very particular for Australia. There were no treaties. There still are no treaties between Aboriginal societies and the Australian colonial state. And that we consider Australia an ongoing colonial military occupation of Aboriginal lands and peoples, and that these lands will be recovered by any means necessary. And obviously, this is in tandem with the ongoing destruction of Palestine, in which we also hold that the Zionist entity is an illegal colonial occupation, and we will continue to support, by any means necessary, the reclamation of Palestinian people's lands. So today, this is a fundraiser, and we have a very special guest, Gerald Horne, who is here to talk about, among other things, his book, The White Pacific, which came out in 2007, but also general questions around settler colonialism and imperialism, which we thought would be particularly relevant to the Australian context, considering that lots of the parallels between the kind of US left class collaboration, we are faced with many similar things here as well. So I think we may be good to go. Oh, yes, just to talk about the fundraiser as well. So, yes, this is a fundraiser for a Black anarchist Aboriginal actionist who took part in some solidarity action as well as many other actions for solidarity with Palestine, and is facing police fines as a result of those actions. So we have come here to support not only a comrade in paying off these fines, as a lot of us are for, but also the fact that we think that it is actually important to continue to have ongoing solidarity with direct action. So whether that's organizations and networks like Palestine Action in the UK targeting Israeli military institutions, or whether it's forms of environmental direct action such as Blockade Australia here, we think direct action is an ongoing course of a legitimate course of action against ongoing forms of extraction, ongoing forms of militarism. And it's very important for us to support our comrades against rising incarceration and kind of police and state attention on kind of resistance work. So this is not only an informational session, educational session, but also, I guess, yes, a kind of flair for solidarity for people, and that we should all continue to support all forms of revolt against colonial and imperial institutions. If you are happy, Gerald, would you like to say anything, or can we start with the first questions?
Start with the questions, and I'll fold in any introductory remarks into my response.
Beautiful. So everyone, we're gonna go through some pre-agreed upon questions by the organizers, and then we're gonna have like 10-20 minutes or so just of questions if you guys have anything. So we'll start off with a general one, which we thought was relevant for kind of I guess organizing and political questions. How would you describe settler colonialism, and why is it important that the left understands settler colonialism today?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm highly appreciative. Settler colonialism is a colonialism of a special type. There are different kinds of colonialism, just like there are different kinds of capitalism, for example. That is to say that the colonialism that has persisted in Nigeria on the western coast of Africa was different from the settler colonialism that reached the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, where the settlers arrived, whereas in Nigeria, the British basically had officialdom and soldiers there to keep the Africans in line, and so they could better exploit the natural resources and the cheap labor of the Africans. If you look at the United States of America, which can be analogized to an extent to Australia, you see the settlers arriving and seeking to liquidate the indigenous population and then bring on across the oceans other Europeans, much more capacious, much broader in the United States, I would argue, than perhaps in any other settler colonial regime. And you have seen a similar process unfold across the Tasman in New Zealand, as you know more than most, not to mention in Algeria, beginning in circa 1830 by the French, not to mention other kinds of settler colonialism, for example, what Imperial Japan sought to do in what is now Northeast China uh, in the 1930s and shortly before, although obviously it was aborted because of the events of World War II. And so settler colonialism, in short and in sum, is colonialism of a special type, colonialism of a particularly gruesome nature, a particularly grisly nature, a particularly bloody nature, which is something that I'm sure your audience in Melbourne is well acquainted with. And speaking of Melbourne, I was remiss in not noting in my introductory remarks that it gives me particular pleasure to speak to folk in Melbourne because, as you probably know, one of the heroes of the US left, the US left wing movement, the labor movement, was Harry Bridges, who was born in Melbourne and migrated to the United States, where he helped to lead the general strike in San Francisco, helped to organize West Coast Longshore, helped to organize workers in Hawaii, the archipelago now similarly occupied by US colonial and military forces, and led that particular union for almost a half century before expiring, and was well known for his pushing through against oftentimes adamant opposition from the bosses and even from some fellow dockers, the desegregation of West Coast Longshore, a legacy that continues to persist to this very day. So, once again, it's always a pleasure to speak to folk in Melbourne, given the heroic legacy of one Harry Bridges.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And following on from this, what is the need? Because, and this is actually very, very relevant here in terms of, I guess, talking about desegregating labor forces. What is the need to understand whiteness as a form of cross-class collaboration, specifically in these colonial contexts?
Well, sadly and tragically, it was the Anglosphere that pioneered in developing this concept of whiteness, for example. As I tell the story in my book on the 16th century, it stems from the fact that after His Catholic Majesty in Spain sponsored Christopher Columbus circa 1492 and got a jump on his fellow Western European pirates in terms of exploiting the Americas in particular, that was followed in 1517 by the secession from the Catholic Church by Martin Luther, which takes London by storm by the 1530s. London wants to get involved in the colonial feast, but is outnumbered. And in any case, His Catholic Majesty made religion a major marker of society. In Spanish Cuba, for example, you could be African and be a conquistador, you could be a conqueror. London, with much more sparse numbers, was the scrappy underdog. And improvisationally, they moved towards whiteness and white supremacy as a major marker of society and as their calling card. And so we see that those with whom London had been warring on the shores of Europe, speaking internally of the Irish, the Scots, and the Welsh. At the end of the, in the 16th century, as London began to send settlers across the Atlantic, particularly to the territory they termed and dubbed North Carolina in the 1580s, magically, as these folks who had been once warring, speaking of the English, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, many of whom were, as they crossed the Atlantic, shopkeepers, workers, declassed elements, lumpen elements, all sponsored by the 1% in London, that is to say, the elite in London, with the mutual goal of mutual enrichment by uprooting the indigenous population and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, being able to drag Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free. It does not take a social scientist to analyze the words I've just uttered and see that this was a class collaborationist project from its inception. That is to say, folks of different class backgrounds being rebranded as, quote, white, unquote, as opposed to warring English versus Irish, for example. And then ultimately, that particular identity politics being expanded to include other ethnic groups who had been warring, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, French Protestant versus French Catholic, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, Serb versus Croat, uh, Greece versus Bulgarian. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic to North America, they're rebranded as white uh, under the rubric of conducting this class collaborationist enterprise. And one cannot begin to understand politics in the United States of America, in particular, the heavyweight champion of settler colonialism, without understanding class collaboration. And that's one of the reasons why we have been disgraced by being administered by so many bloodily incompetent leaders, such as the Tangerine Tyrant, who is now occupying the White House as we speak. Sadly and unfortunately, for various reasons, many of our friends on the left have been reluctant to accept this concept of settler colonialism, have been reluctant to analyze class collaboration. As a matter of fact, many in my community, the Black community, they feel that a requirement for being part of the US left is that you make excuses for class collaboration, for example, and that you think of different rationales to justify class collaboration. I mean, for example, in the United States right now, the Tangerine Tyrant has launched a campaign against desegregation. Of course, it's carried forth under the rubric of promoting diversity, for example, and other basically liberal concepts. But desegregation is the ultimate aim. Some of our friends on the left say that these measures are designed to disrupt class struggle, when actually they're designed to disrupt class collaboration, for example. I oftentimes cite the example of the construction trades unions in New York City, which oftentimes had in their charter so-called white-only provisos. And with these relatively well-paid construction trades, carpenters, hod carriers, electricians, bricklayers, for example, you could only join that union if your father was part of the union, for example. And so they were basically a kind of monopoly, a so-called white monopoly. And so what you had were that Black trade unionists and Black carpenters, electricians at a certain point began conducting sort of aggressive diversity measures by disrupting building sites, for example. So they were not seeking to disrupt class struggle. They were just seeking to disrupt class collaboration. And one of the reasons why the US left has not been more potent and powerful has been precisely because of its difficulty in comprehending class collaboration. And just to advert for a second with regard to something you already know, which is that in the lucky country, class collaboration has not been unknown, for example. That is to say, this idea that those crossing the Pacific after London loses its battle with the settlers in the 1780s, that a central mission of many of these settlers was, of course, uprooting the indigenous population, taking their land, and then importing more individuals and communities that could be defined as, quote, white, unquote, for their mutual enrichment. And so it's basically a class collaborationist enterprise. Of course, by stressing this, I would not want to denigrate the ability of some to overcome. I mentioned Harry Bridges of Melbourne intentionally. Obviously, he would be defined as, quote, white, unquote, in Melbourne, but obviously he was able to commit that kind of race suicide and embark on a lengthy battle on behalf of class struggle, albeit across the Pacific in California.
Yeah, I think lots of comrades here, particularly those from the Black People's Union, have experienced familiar arguments and debates with the quote unquote white left and unions here on the question of class struggle. So following on from this, in the White Pacific, specifically your 2007 book, you talk about South Sea Islanders and Aboriginal people from this continent being under siege, drawing a direct analogy to the US colonial frontier. Can you tell us more about the role that the colonization of Australia has played in expanding imperialism and capitalism in the Pacific?
Well, your territory, now known as Queensland, was essential to this process. In my book, The White Pacific, I focus heavily upon the US nationals who migrated across the Pacific to the lucky country post 1865. That is to say, after the abolition of enslavement of Africans, they had developed a taste, a rather perverse taste for exploitation of dark-skinned labor. And so what happens is that not only in Queensland, but in Fiji, they begin to ensnare, people we would call Melanesians, people we would call Polynesians, and in a real sense, basically enslaving them. Now, this is taking place, as I point out in the book, and I'm actually writing another book as a follow-on as we speak that'll come out next year. It's taking place in the context of the effort of the Hawaii Kingdom to halt this kind of labor exploitation by confederating or federating many of the small islands, what is oftentimes referred to as Micronesia, for example, up to and including joining hands with those in what we would call Papua New Guinea, for example. The Hawaii Kingdom, although it's not very well known, was very sophisticated diplomatically. I would say that with regard to indigenous people who were overwhelmed now under the US flag, that the Hawaii Kingdom had the most sophisticated diplomatic outreach. They had missions and legations all over the world, in London and South Africa, and United States. Of course, they had comrades in Melbourne as well, who were working with the Hawaii Kingdom. And for its troubles of seeking to block this kind of labor exploitation, the Hawaii Kingdom, first of all, you have the so-called Bayonet Constitution of 1887, whereby the king was forced to sign a document clipping his wings and once again turning over power to an elite, self-defined, self-described white elite in Hawaii. And that raises the footnote that I trust and I hope that our friends and comrades in Australia will investigate, because one of the conclusions I've arrived at is that there hasn't been sufficient interrogation of republicanism as it has been applied throughout the centuries, certainly in the United States and many of the other countries that pioneered in republicanism or anti-monarchy. They had, shall we say, great difficulty in incorporating those not defined as white. And certainly that was the case in Hawaii, because they overthrew the kingdom on the premise that republicanism was more progressive, a canard accepted by many of our friends on the left, by the way. At the same time, once they seized power, circa 1887, with the Bayonet Constitution and with the coup of 1893, one of the first things they did was to circumscribe the ability of Asians to vote. Because to this very day, the plurality of the population in the archipelago of Hawaii, or Japanese, or of Japanese ancestry, I should say, and of course, those who challenge that notion say that the plurality is actually a Filipino ancestry, for example. And these Republicans, so called, were seeking to circumscribe their right to vote. And so, in other words, to make a long story short, the White Kingdom is trying to block blackbirding, this process, notorious process of labor exploitation involving the shameless exploitation of people we would refer to as Melanesian and Polynesian. And for its troubles, it's overthrown. A so-called white elite, Republican elite, takes power, circumscribes the right of non-whites to vote, begins to persecute the indigenous Hawaiian population, turning Hawaii into an apartheid colony, and then incorporating Hawaii into the United States by 1959 as the 50th and presumed final state. I say presumed because, as you know, the Tangerine Tyrant has talked about annexing Canada. Don't be surprised if Australia is next, by the way. If there's discussion about annexing Australia. And just as a footnote, with regard to Australian history, we know that it was tied to the crown in London for decades, if not centuries, and then post-World War II, it ties itself to the apron strings of Uncle Sam. And I'm wondering, in light of these stories that appeared in the press just of the last week about Chinese ships off the coast of Australia, if the Tangerine Tyrant seeks to annex Australia, will that initiative be supported or be opposed? Now, in Canada, it's opposed, at least thus far.
Well, yeah. So we were thinking about this. So I guess so on this about Hawaii, and also, you'd be familiar with, the movement towards AUKUS, the American,
Mm-hmm.
Australia, and British kind of
Mm-hmm.
military alliance, which there's been, at least some attempts at movements against here, but it seems to be that's the way the wind's blowing. But we'll actually move up to another question, which may be more relevant on this, and also thinking about Hawaii as well. So, as you've talked about, so there's been ongoing solidarity between Black Aboriginal organisations in Australia and the struggles against the Indonesian and French colonial occupations in West Papua and Kanaki. There's also, as far as I'm aware, an upcoming Indigenous conference coming up in Hawaii soon, which some
Mm-hmm.
Aboriginal elders are actually going to go and attend. So in reference to what you were discussing in terms of, in the 1880s, led by Hawaii, there's this idea of a trans-Pacific confederation to offset the advances of like Britain, America, and kind of German imperialism in the Pacific. And I guess, in tying that to today in terms of AUKUS and the attempt to kind of create this kind of like military NATO-like alliance in the Pacific, in thinking about Black sovereignty movements in Australia today, how important do you think the kind of national liberation struggles in like Kanaki, West Papua, and like Hawaii are in reference to a kind of, I guess, trans-Pacific kind of struggles, like joint indigenous struggles?
Well, obviously, they're exceedingly important. And I'm very optimistic about this upcoming meeting in Hawaii because I've been following carefully the struggles of the indigenous people across the Tasman, particularly in the nation oftentimes referred to as New Zealand. Part of the problem, as we know, is that many of these struggles have been atomized. That is to say, since the attempts of the Hawaii Kingdom in the late 19th century to bring together these struggles under one umbrella, the struggles have been separated and have been diffused to an extent. And it reminds me of the Caribbean, for example, which is also comprised of many small islands, but of late they've sought to come together under the rubric of CARICOM, the Caribbean Community. Now they are meeting with the African Union, the continental organization headquartered in Ethiopia, in September of 2025. High on the agenda will be reparations for enslavement. Some of us are suggesting that also on the agenda should be coordination of a sanctions campaign against this US administration because of its abuse of Black people in North America and its attempt to intimidate South Africa and other African nations as we speak. I think it would be well if your comrades, indigenous comrades in the South Seas, could consider attending this meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, September 7th, 2025, because I dare say that you not only have to consolidate the struggles in the South Seas and the South Pacific of these various indigenous groupings, but also reaching out across the borders and across the oceans to those who are similarly situated. For example, the Black people of the Caribbean, the Black people of North America, and ultimately the Black people of Africa itself.
Yeah, no, 100%. So yeah, I guess we've had some discussions as well, and I know some comrades with the BPU that should be here today about, I guess, yeah, the relevance of how we organize a kind of left anti-imperialism in relation to various national liberation struggles in the South Pacific and how that can relate to a kind of, I guess, offsetting the advances of AUKUS through building national alliances between Black and Indigenous peoples in the South Pacific in that sense. So I guess on that, this was a question from our BPU comrades. In your research more broadly, such as your book on the Counter-Revolution of 1776, you've exposed how so-called democratic revolutions often actually played out as counter-revolutions to protect white settler and capitalist interests against, burgeoning African and indigenous and white working class unrest. How do you see this playing out in Australia today, where even so-called progressive movements generally refuse to center decolonization?
Well, I think what we have to realize is that this construction of whiteness and its underlying precept of class collaboration has been very seductive. Uh, and it's perhaps understandable. I mean, oftentimes, I wrote a book on Texas a few years ago, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And as I talk about in that book, if you look at certain indigenous peoples of North America, like the Cherokee of the southeast quadrant of what is now the United States, they sought to assimilate. They enslaved Africans. They engaged in sedentary agriculture. They converted to Christianity, etc. But they still had to go, and they were expelled from their land. And what's interesting is that European migrants, fresh off the boat, oftentimes moved into their mansions because many of these people were quite affluent. They were slave owners. And so this was a very powerful benefit that you could come from Europe relatively poor and move into a mansion. I mean, we should not distract or detract from the idea that for some, there was an American dream. I mean, can you imagine being poor in Europe and living in a mansion in North America with all the accoutrements, for example? And so it's understandable to a certain degree why class collaboration exists and persists, because for some, it's conveyed material benefits. The problem now for those who have benefited from class collaboration is that it's unclear to me, to look at the heavyweight champion of class collaboration speaking and white supremacy speaking of the United States, if given the changing correlation of forces generally, the rise of China, the rise of the BRICS, etc., if these attempts by the current US administration will be able to deliver to the 77 million who voted for him. And on the one hand, that could lead to a diminishing of the pro-Trump bloc. But on the other hand, given the lack of political education and ideological awareness in a country like this, it could set the stage for a new kind of US fascism, for example. So I dare say that Australia, which oftentimes touts itself as being a kind of cousin of the United States of America, after all, the histories have been interlinked to a certain degree, as you probably know, and as I indicated a moment or two ago, as London lost its colonies in North America, it was looking for another dumping ground for prisoners in particular. And so, therefore, they move across the Pacific, circa 1788, to what is now called Australia. So I trust and I hope that the folks in the quote lucky country, unquote, will learn the lessons, whatever lessons there are to learn about this difficult experience that we're enduring here in North America as we speak.
Yeah, I was just thinking on this about how I remember in the White Pacific, you talk you talk briefly about how the White Australia policy, in which, like, Australia is seen as kind of uh, a bulwark, like, against immigration, like its border systems and stuff are kind of like followed throughout Europe, like in places like Britain or America, they go, oh, we want to have a kind of Australian style, kind of border and immigration system. And obviously lots of this comes from the White Australia policy, basically a founding policy of the Australian Union was the White Australia policy. But you talk about how a big influence on the creation of the White Australia policy was Australia essentially being able to learn from America in terms of the fallout from the Civil War, in that they didn't want a potential, basically, racialized working class or kind of lumpen class that could actually threaten them. So could you potentially speak about that in the relation to, the White Australia policy, and also, I guess focusing a bit on the whiteness and class collaboration that kind of emerges out of the Australian kind of context?
Well, as the book tries to suggest, there is a connection between blackbirding and the retreat of blackbirding in Australia and the creation of the White Australia policy insofar as there were those in your country who felt that having these dark-skinned people on your land was a not very good idea. And then, of course, they come together to have a consolidation of that particular project. One of the lessons that we should absorb is how this perniciousness is oftentimes driven into retreat by external events. I mean, for example, as you probably know, in the aftermath of World War I, circa 1918, 1919, Imperial Japan tried to have installed in the peace treaty and as a principle of international law, an anti-racism principle. But your prime minister in particular opposed this because they feared the impact it would have domestically, for example. And of course, your prime minister, I think his name was Billy Hughes, he was then backed by the US administration because the US administration was then led by Woodrow Wilson, who, although he had been a governor of New Jersey, was actually born in segregationist, white supremacist Virginia, for example. And one of the lessons of the struggle against class collaboration and the struggle against white supremacy and whiteness itself has been the importance of these international movements and international trends and international developments in supplying backup, in supplying external shocks to the system of iniquity, which is why the true class conscious comrades have to be internationalists. They should not be trapped by focusing wholly and exclusively on the domestic scene. Now, of course, you should be quite conversant with the domestic scene. Needless to say, I think that's obvious. But as this upcoming meeting in Honolulu suggests, or I assume it's Honolulu, upcoming meeting in Hawaii suggests, and as the meeting in Ethiopia suggests, ultimately, the winning ticket for our team, for our side, is internationalism.
Yeah, thank you for that. And couldn't agree more. We've been having similar discussions on how we can build those kind of internationalisms here as well in terms of Black sovereignty movements and anti-imperialism with Palestine and Kanaki and so forth. So we think we might go for questions now, if you're happy with that, Gerald.
Of course.
So if people are okay, maybe do a thing where if people can raise a hand and then I'll choose someone to unmute if anybody has any questions, and we'll go for maybe like 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes or so. And yeah, if you can question more than a comment. And if it is a comment, then keep it short. Yep. Should we go Fred first?
Actually, maybe go Stephen first.
Oh no, it's okay. No, yeah, Stephen's good. You're good to go first, Fred.
Okay. 1 second. I had it typed out. Paste. Well, first, thanks for speaking today. I guess I have a couple questions. I'm not sure which ones to ask, so I'll ask both of them. And
it's right if you just ask. Yeah, just maybe ask one of which you think is the most important.
Okay. Yes. How on earth can we decolonize a settler colony when the overwhelming majority of people are settlers? Has this ever been done before in history?
Not sure. Look at South Africa, for example. I mean, of course, in South Africa, the overwhelming majority of the people were not settlers. The overwhelming majority were the exploited Africans. And obviously, you had defeats for settler colonialism in Rhodesia, Namibia, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Algeria, 1962, Kenya, 1963. If you accept the premise that settler colonialism cannot be defeated, well, I guess we should all go to the beach. We should leave this call and go to the beach and maybe get high, you know. But I don't subscribe to that idea. I mean, obviously the struggle is going to be protracted and difficult. Even numerically, um, it reminds me of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which of course was a turning point in world history, a successful revolt of the unpaid sector of the working class. So you had all of these exploited Africans, hardly without weapons. They were slaves working on sugar plantations, but they had leadership that was able to, first of all, take advantage of the contradictions between and amongst the European powers. That is to say, allying with the British against the French, allying with the Spanish against the British, etc. And I think that there's a lesson to be learned there. That is to say, that's why I've spoken about internationalism. You just can't be confined to the Australian space. You have to internationalize the struggle and then began to win over the real and imagined enemies of Canberra, for example, the real and imagined enemies of the settler state. And the international environment right now in your neck of the woods is very conducive, given the hysteria about China, given the long-standing hysteria about Asia generally, going back to World War II and the run-up to World War II, going back, that's why I brought up Versailles and the struggle against Japan and their attempt to have anti-racism be invoked as a principle of international law. I mean, so yes, the fact that there's a significant settler population is a formidable barrier, but it's not impossible because, I mean, Australia has a population of what, 20 some million? And China has a population of 1.4 billion. I mean, these people are lucky they've survived this long.
I've been told that Stephen's happy for you to go again, Fred, if you do have another quick question.
Maybe I'll wait.
Okay.
Okay, no problem. No, thank you for that question. Yeah, was there anyone else that had a question? Tom, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, again, thank you, Gerald, for sharing what you have so far. My question jumps a bit out of the Australian context, so my apologies to the crowd there today. I was wondering, obviously, kind of in the news the last few days, the kind of Trump-Zelensky debacle has been pretty interesting to observe, and I was wondering if you had kind of any thoughts about how Ukraine's been negotiated by, as you say, the tangerine tyrant, and how its treatment by the US and by the political elites in the US is connected, if there's connections to the production of whiteness that you talk about in the White Pacific.
Well, I think that the Ukraine crisis reflects a split, obviously, in the U.S. ruling class. The Biden wing, they were on a fool's errand. They were trying to confront Russia and China simultaneously. I think part of the reasons why the opposition Democratic Party gets involved in so many debacles, be it Vietnam, for example, be it the crisis in Afghanistan, after all, that was accelerated under Democratic President, the now sainted Jimmy Carter, for example, is that a base for the Democratic Party is the Black community that has been forced to back off from internationalism, back off from foreign policy. That was the concession that was made in order to retreat from US apartheid. You would retreat from US apartheid, but you have to throw the internationalists led by the late, great Paul Robeson, who visited your country some decades ago. And so the Black community has basically been mute with regard to foreign policy, but for the downside for the US ruling class is that it leads to misestimations of the global correlation of forces by the opposition, such as this fool's errand of trying to confront Russia and China simultaneously. So the Trump team comes in, they feel that they can cut a deal with Russia over Ukraine. And then, of course, ultimately, this is being resisted. As you saw the meeting in London today of Sir Keir Starmer. And by the way, speaking of Sir Keir Starmer, that plays a role with regard to what I raised about republicanism, because he was asked explicitly at the White House about Trump attempts to annex Canada. Now, King Charles III is technically the head of state in Canada. And yet King Charles III is inviting the man who's threatening his realm, speaking of Canada, for another state visit. I mean, this is, I find it incredible that it hasn't been much more of an issue in Canada. But in any case, so Trump wants to focus like a laser beam on China. And of course, this is facilitated because China is an Asian country. There's a long tradition of whiteness and white supremacy in the United States of America. It leads to anti-Asian violence. It leads to anti-Asian bigotry. And it probably will help to propel this Cold War II against China and raising up this anti-Asian furor, which is happening as we speak. So in other words, the current moment cannot be separated from this long history of white supremacy, cannot be separated from this long history of the construction of whiteness, cannot be separated from the class collaboration that underpins and undergirds it. But the problem is that the United States is not necessarily advantaged during this new Cold War with China, because China, by some measures, already has a larger economy than the United States of America. The People's Bank of Beijing keeps the US government afloat by loaning the US government money, by buying US paper, treasury bills, so-called. So in other words, China is helping to finance this US government that's seeking to destabilize China. That doesn't make any sense. That's unsustainable in the long run. And so there's a real crisis in the offing. And as a matter of fact, I've used this analogy. There was this famous Black basketball coach named Nolan Richardson, University of Arkansas Razorbacks. And he would put so much pressure on the opposing team that he says that the opposing team would have a collective nervous breakdown in the middle of the game. And I think that what's happening right now in the United States is sort of a collective nervous breakdown, not only in the United States, but also in the North Atlantic community. When J.D. Vance, the US vice president, gave that speech at the Munich Security Conference a week or two ago, where he did not focus on Russia and China, he didn't mention Ukraine, he started denouncing the internal politics of Germany, his host, saying that they're not kind enough to the Nazi-curious Alternative for Germany party. So after he finished speaking, the organizer of the conference comes to the podium and he burst out crying. I mean, he starts boohooing like a baby, uncontrollably. It's like he's having a nervous breakdown. And the Zelensky-Trump Vance spat in the Oval Office, it was almost like another kind of example of a collective nervous breakdown. I thought they were going to start throwing blows at each other in the Oval Office before TV cameras of the world. I think we're going to have to expect more of this, because I think that US imperialism is in obvious decline. to have not only is U.S. imperialism in decline, but this system of whiteness and white supremacy, a centuries-long project, is being subjected to enormous pressure by not only China, but the rise of the BRICS as well. And so this is something new historically. It's going to be very difficult for some people to absorb and to deal with. And so what I just described at the Munich Security Conference in terms of folks crying uncontrollably, or what you saw in the Oval Office in terms of thinking that leaders are going to be fighting on camera, this is going to become the norm, I'm afraid to say, which of course opens up opportunities for our side, but obviously it's quite dangerous at the same time.
Yeah, I think we can all look forward to more battles in the Oval Office, and hopefully, yeah, some in Canberra as well, maybe. Gugar, maybe we should have Gugar as the last question.
What's that mean? Oh, sorry. Hi, Roscoe Lee Brown here. I've spent a little bit of time in Kanaki in the recent past, and I was listening the other day to an old fellow in Brisbane, Wayne Wharton, talking about what he's calling the global racism force. And I wondered about the expansion of whiteness. I know in the Kanaki situation, Macron has basically run a coup on a democratically elected Kanaki government, the longest running government in Kanaki or in New Caledonian history, turned over on Christmas Eve by settler loyalists who are paid some billions of francs to withdraw their support for the government. It looks like the project in Kanaki is to move about 45,000 settlers to Noumea and claim Noumea as a state or the territory, and give the rest of the country, or allow the rest of the country to be divided up by Kanaki. So I wonder what your view about the way there seems to be an attempt to expand the colonies. I get your point, and I do agree that we're at the end stage of something, but it's an interesting play at this late stage to be trying to establish white settler outposts in the middle of the Pacific Ocean who expressly call themselves Zionists and say that we, the Kaldush, the loyalist French, are oppressed by the Kanaki in the same way as the Palestinians oppress Israelis.
Well, first of all, the expansion of whiteness is nothing new, at least from the US experience. Oftentimes, and I probably did it today, I speak of this construction of whiteness as an offshoot of Europeanism. I speak of the creation of the United States being a precursor to the European Union to an extent, in the sense that all of these Europeans of different ancestries group themselves under one umbrella, one rubric, not unlike the European Union headquartered in Brussels with 24 plus member states. But actually, as I pointed out in another context, that given the religious roots of whiteness, we should not be surprised by the fact that Lebanese Christians have been admitted into the hallowed halls of whiteness in the United States of America, Egyptian Christians, Palestinian Christians, for example, with all the privileges attendant thereto. And likewise, politically, as you probably know, a major strand of the settler population in what we call New Caledonia stems from the defeat of the Paris Commune, circa 1870, 1871, one of the early attempts to establish a kind of anti-capitalism. And of course, they were all expelled, just like folks were expelled to what we call Australia in 1788. They're expelled, and now, of course, their descendants, as you put it, are not necessarily carrying on the traditions of the Paris Commune, but carrying on the tradition of those who sought to crush the Paris Commune, which speaks once again to the seductiveness of class collaboration, the seductiveness of whiteness and white supremacy. But at the same time, we have to be clear that these ongoing efforts, such as what you described in what we call New Caledonia, in many ways they're signs of weakness and not necessarily signs of strength. That is to say, scrambling to retain, if not accelerate, certain privileges at a time when the world is changing, when the rug globally is pulled out from under them. All that means is that victory is certain for our side, but it will not be simple nor easy.
Yes, I think on that note, that is a positive yet also Gramscian fitting way to end this fundraiser talk. So thank you, Gerald, and everyone else that has attended this talk. We'll pass on the recording to comrades who couldn't make it as well. So yeah, we've had this recorded, and we're going to pass this on too. So thank you, Gerald, for coming and giving such a brilliant and informative talk. And we should all take, very inspiring lessons for what we can do going forward in terms of confronting Australian and US imperialism and colonialism. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, and good luck to you. I'm signing off.
Cheers, guys. Thank you, Gerald.
Thank you, Gerald.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gerald. Yeah. Hey, thanks for that. Thanks for putting that on.
No, thank you for coming. Thanks for such a good question.
Well, that's it's an interesting. It's interesting that no one will believe me that they are Zionists.
Yes, that's it makes sense though, doesn't it? In the way in which Zionism is now Zionism is the thing which people are kind of drawing upon